Welcome to this edition of Great Books, a lively discussion of a selection from the canon of exceptional literature. Here's your host, Jack Hatfield.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us for the Great Book Show. I'm Jack Hatfield. Our panel meets periodically to discuss great works of classic and modern literature. Les will introduce our selection for today, David Hume's Of Personal Identity. Les?
David Hume, 1711 to 1776, is one of the giants of 18th century philosophy. His erudition covers philosophy, economics, history, and also as an essayist. Hume had a major impact on Western thinking, including such areas as empiricism, utilitarianism, logical positivism, analytical philosophy, cognitive science, and theology. Some of those who give credit to Hume with their thinking process include Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Immanuel Kant, Albert Einstein, and Noam Chomsky. His approach to problem solving uses the inductive reasoning method, that is, bottom-up logic, based upon the use of empirical data. Inductive reasoning posits a given premise that supplies strong evidence for the truth of the conclusion reached and is based upon probability. Deductive reasoning, top-down logic, links a given set of premises with the conclusions. If all the premises are presumed to be true and the terms are clear, the rules of deductive logic are followed, then the conclusion arrived at must necessarily be true. In this presentation of the Great Books, we will be addressing Hume's essay titled Of Personal Identity. In other words, how do you arrive at a concept of the self? Please join us as we delve into a somewhat complicated look at the reality in which all of us participate.
Question just to make sure we have a common understanding. I think his use of self, personal identity, and soul he uses in the same way. Do you think that's true?
He negates the soul, I know that.
Yeah.
But he certainly says the self is the same as the identity.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I'm going to be using them interchangeably. Then, do you agree that his main thesis is that the self is not static, that it's ever-changing? Is that his main?
I think his main thesis is it's a product of our imagination.
Right, but it's, okay.
And therefore it doesn't really exist. We just imagine it to exist.
Right.
So that begs a question, what's reality? And I don't know that he addressed that in here.
Well, I think he does, but we can.
Going back to your first question, Jeff, didn't he say that some people have a principle of the soul and they have something that I don't have? Do you remember
He says
that?
some people disagree with him,
did,
but
yeah.
if they think they have
Have
a
a
self,
soul.
well, maybe they do,
No.
but I certainly don't.
I
when
don't
look
have one.
inside
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah. He
And
said
this-
they might have something I don't have.
Right.
I think it was an understanding of soul is what he meant. But anyway, that's
Yeah.
him.
Because
Right.
he was talking about when he looks within himself and he's looking for that self and he's looking for that personal identity, all he sees are his perceptions.
Yeah,
And
right.
he can't find a self or an identity within himself.
He had a pretty strong statement. He says, people are just a collection of ever-changing perceptions. And that just, it's kind of, it's very interesting that he says that.
I don't know about his thesis that we're all just perceptions. A perception is something that's perceived. What's doing the perceiving? He doesn't have something that's doing the perceiving.
It doesn't have to.
Yeah, he
can just-
says perceptions just go by.
It can be just perceiving without a subject-object.
But there has to be there has to be a perceiver to start it. Where does it come from?
It's just perceiving. It's just a function of the mind that's perceiving.
Think. Who thinks? Love. Who loves?
That's part of an argument against Descartes. Cogito ergo sum.
Cogito ergo sum?
Yeah, I think, therefore I am. And Hume doesn't agree with that.
Yeah, I know, but there are philosophers who do agree
Right,
with
yes.
that.
Yeah.
In the first paragraph of this, he talks about some people who think that you can't argue about identity. If you don't agree with an identity, you can't have any arguments at all. There's nothing else to be said. So those people, I think, therefore I am,
Right.
believe that the self and the identity is the most important thing that comes before everything else, and you can't argue it. And Hume then proceeds to argue it.
Right, he sets
is
up a straw
interesting.
man. I mean, he creates this artificial argument to the beginning so that he can tear it apart.
I don't think it's artificial. I think it's held
he's
by a
saying
lot of
like
people.
well, from his point of view, it's kind of a straw man. He's setting it up and then he takes it apart.
What I think is a straw man here isn't the idea of identity, it's his definition that an identity has to be unchanging. And therefore, since none of our identities are unchanging, there's no such thing as an identity.
Right.
But that comes from his definition of what he means by identity.
Yes. Don't you think that's commonly held?
I am a person. My body changes, but I'm still that person, and my self inside is changing, but I think I'm still that. I still have that identity, even though my identity is changing, just like my body changes. And he talks about rivers changing and plants changing. But he's saying because plants change, they therefore don't have the same identity. We just imagine that they do because the perception that we have of them changing is so gradual.
That's where time enters the argument.
But then, isn't there a plant? Then he's saying that therefore plants don't really exist either? It's just part of our imagination?
He's saying like we exist, and
Right.
he says plants exist. But he uses an oak tree. He says it's a little, very small tree, and then it gets to be a very big tree, and it dies, but it's always an oak tree.
Therefore, why isn't our identity always our identity, even though it changes? But he comes and says an identity has to be unchanging. And that's what he argues in this whole
If any
essay.
impression gives us the idea of self, that impression or idea remains the same thought for our lifetime.
Why?
I think
that's his premise, and he's going and he argues that premise. And inductive reasoning, if all the premises are true, and all the arguments follow from that, then he has a cogent argument. And the question is that premise true?
I think the argument is, do many people hold that
Premise
view?
to be true, yeah.
Right.
And
And I think
he
they
comes
do.
out right away and says that a lot of people don't feel
Right.
the same way he does.
But inductive reasoning is more based upon probability than fact.
Based on,
Probability.
Yeah.
It's based on his
Well, your
definition
premise has
of
to
what
be
an
valid.
identity or a self
Well,
is.
yes.
if you don't have a valid,
But even with that approach to analysis and reasoning, they will never hold that the result is 100% true. They'll say it's a probability, whereas deductive reasoning will tell you if you follow the syllogism with all 4 steps, then what is true is therefore true because you've proved it in all the steps.
I would argue that, but it's not appropriate.
Right.
I disagree with that, but
you would argue that?
yes, very much so. But we'll do that afterwards.
That's another
What,
one.
what about, okay, what you said about the self, and there's something that's common through the years, from you were 10 and you were 30 and onward. What about people that have hang-ups like we all have, and phobias and all that, that seems to be, as Freud said, something to do with our childhood? Is this negate that? I don't think it does. But
I don't think it does either. But I thought it was interesting that he says that when he goes to sleep at night, he stops perceiving.
He's dead.
And therefore, he has
didn't
no
get that.
self or identity.
Yeah.
right.
Now, I think
He didn't say he's dead.
one of the other things that's not in here, because I don't think it's been discovered yet, is the unconscious of people. Because he only talks about conscious thought and conscious perceptions, and those hang-ups that you were just talking about is why I'm speaking about this now. Those hang-ups often come from our unconscious, and they're there in the back, and Hume doesn't address that at all, because I don't think at the time it was acknowledged that there's
No,
some
but I don't think it makes a
unconscious.
difference. I mean, he just you're right, because he does talk about conscious, only conscious. But It doesn't make any difference. He would say the unconscious doesn't change. It does change constantly also, as well as
How
our
would he know
conscious.
that?
Well, he didn't.
Because we can't access our unconscious.
No.
Jack, he says, when my perceptions are removed, like
Right.
sleep,
Yeah.
I am said not to exist.
Right.
That's dead.
Well,
Well, then he goes on and he says, if I die or if I stop.
Same
And
thing as sleep,
Therefore,
right.
he mentions soul as, there'd like be no soul because there's nothing to perceive. There's no more perceptions, so therefore there's no more identity, there's no more
Right.
self, and there's no more soul.
is he saying that we can't change our character?
I can't change ourselves.
No,
Character.
He says you can change your character because you don't have an unchanging identity. You're just imagining you have a self and an identity. You're just a mess of perceptions going past. And the only reason you think you have a self is because of your memory.
Right.
And because some of your thoughts are similar to your previous thoughts and you can remember them, you sort of like tie them together under this unifying principle of self.
Mm-hmm.
And he also says if things have cause and effect, you also block them together and come up with
Right.
this idea of self. But without memory, you wouldn't have any idea of your identity or yourself. And I agree with that,
Yeah.
because if you don't remember anything, then you don't know who you are, and you don't know what you are, and you don't know how you normally perceive things.
How about when you do remember and you don't know who you are?
That's a problem nowadays. As to one of the things he says here to your point there is, as to causation, we may observe that the true idea of the human mind is to consider it as a system of different perceptions or different existences, which are linked together by the relation of cause and effect, and mutually produce, destroy, influence, and modify each other.
Yes.
Well, that's one of them. He has
That's
three.
what it is.
right,
There's
in-
three.
Resemblance and cause,
uh,
what was the other one? Contiguity.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
he's eliminated contiguity is not
Yeah.
really a factor, so.
Yeah, well, I don't know why he said, why he didn't say continuance. It would be much easier
Well, it was
to
probably
pronounce.
an English word at the time. And then he went on to say, I cannot compare the soul more properly to anything than to a republic of or commonwealth in which several members are united by the reciprocal ties of government and subordination, and give rise to other persons who propagate the same republic in an incessant change of its parts. So one of his analysis here, he's talking
The
about a
ship,
ship.
the
The
ship.
ship that's constantly being rebuilt, but
Right.
just keeps saying it's the same ship.
That's a-
So
Right.
it boils on, I think all this are,
And he did the same thing with the church, if I remember.
right, yes,
Right.
yeah. I mean, this comes from Aristotle with his accidents and essences, what makes up.
The essence.
Right, the essence and the accidents.
Accidental
Right.
qualities
Can you
and
separate
essential
the two and
qualities.
still have the.
And
have
he's
the
saying
body?
that essence is not
Right,
a set thing. It's always changing.
right.
But,
Man's essence?
Yes.
explain to me why he says the ship is still the same ship, even though it's rebuilt.
Right.
Yes.
And you still call the church the same church, even if it burns
Because
to
of
the
the
ground and gets
parishioners.
rebuilt.
Yeah.
But you don't have the same identity because it changes. But you have
Well,
a ship. It's not the exact same ship, but it's still the ship. It's
Right,
still
now
the
you're into
church.
the problem of definition with words. Same, what constitutes something that is the same? So if you take
Which
it
is the
as-
crux of his argument.
Right, well, if you take something that's the same, you're assuming there is no change to it. But his argument is there's constant change going on. In a matter of time, we don't see it.
But he's making the assumption that people think that something has to be unchanged to be the same.
Correct. Again, it's the use of language.
It's his premise, too.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, he says, very interesting later toward the end, he says, questions about personal identity are grammatical, not philosophical difficulties. So, and he says, as far as the church and the ship, he's saying if they serve the same function, that in that way they're the same. So, and he uses a very good example when he says a church burns down and they build another one of different materials and serving the same community. In that sense it's same as before. At least we think so.
The community's the same.
Right.
Yeah.
But he's saying that a lot of people think the church is the
They still call it by the same name.
Right.
Right. But I liked his explanation of a river, because a
Right.
river, if you leave it for an hour, all the water that used to be there is gone. If the river is the water, well, then it's all entirely new water. So is it still the same river, or is it a different river, or is there not really a river at all? It's just a series of perceptions that you have that are sort of like tied together with cause and effect and contiguity and similarity.
There's a Chinese or Buddhist saying that you can never step
It's
twice into the same river.
Heraclides.
And that is true.
Yeah. Well, what?
And that is true. So I think I'm like a river, but I'm still the river, and all these perceptions are going through me, but still there's something that makes the water flow. There's something that sees the water flow. There's something that's doing the perception that I
So-
consider an identity, and he doesn't. He says that thing is, I'm just imagining that thing
Yes.
that is doing the perceiving.
That there's no commonality between when you were 10 and now. There's nothing that was unchanging through that.
Would you, if you were given a set of circumstances and you had to make a decision, would you make the same decision you did at 10 or 15 that you would make today?
No,
Okay,
because
it
I've
depends.
changed.
Right, okay.
So I'm not the identical person that I used to be, and myself is not the identical self that it used to be. But that doesn't mean that I don't have a self, and he would say that would mean that I don't have a self,
Right.
that I'm just imagining it.
So
But who's doing the imagining?
We are.
He's saying it's an imagine. Who's doing the imagining?
we are.
Self.
But that's myself. That's my identity. So,
So the self and identity are the same and they're not the same.
Well,
he's saying there is no identity or self.
yeah.
But they're changing all the time.
Right,
Right.
yes.
And he's saying that there's two ways we can just call it the self, grammatical, or we can make up some mysterious
Right.
sort of, kind of what you were aiming toward is, I don't know what it is, but there's something that's commonality that's from moment to moment.
One of the things he said here is identity depends on the relations of ideas, and these relations produce identity by means of that easy transition that they occasion. So nothing's fixed.
But
Yeah.
the other thing I get is he says there's all these perceptions, but all of our perceptions are necessarily subjective. So my perception is different from your perception.
Sure.
What makes my perception different from your perception? Other than
identity.
Yes, yes. But
No.
he's saying there's no such thing as identity.
I wouldn't say it's identity, it's causes and conditions. It's you're conditioned differently than I'm conditioned. And that kind of works.
But
on
That's
Yeah,
a
like we
cause of
have different
identity.
eyesight, so even what we see,
Well,
we
different
see
experience,
differently.
yeah,
Like,
different experiences.
so therefore,
Yeah.
you can go on from
that's the
there.
cause of identity, isn't it? What you just said?
That we're different.
Yeah.
Well, again, one of the things he said here, in this view, therefore, memory does not so much produce as discover personal identity by showing us the relation of cause and effect among our different perceptions.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
In your
That's
words?
Yeah,
we
what
just
does
said-
that
that's what we just
mean?
said.
Say it.
Our memory and we make the future that we're looking at. Our perception will change. On a given topic, we may agree, but on another topic, we may disagree, with all four of us looking at the very same thing. And we'll take a different take on what we see.
Great movie. Rashomon.
Oh, no, this is a Woody Allen.
No, Rashomon.
Woody Allen would have a ball with this.
Which he has, I don't know, 4 or 5 people looking at a scene of violence, and then he switches from character to character to show how they different interpret it. Let me, so what? That's what I like to ask in a philosophical treatise is, how does he saying we should live our lives this way, with this understanding of kind of true reality, or is there any use for the idea of a self? So it gets down to so what?
Well, know thyself. I mean, one of the.
How can
That's
you live
Aristotle.
your life
Aristotle.
without an idea of yourself?
I thought it was Socrates.
No, I think
Know thyself.
Know thyself.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Everything in
Aristotle, I
moderation.
think.
yeah, it was Socrates.
But how can you live your life without an idea of self?
Just doing stuff.
What, Jack?
Just doing, talking. You don't need an idea of self to do that. You don't think of,
Cause and
Oh,
effect.
well,
you just do.
oh no. That's, your values are part of yourself. It's not just you, so you have to establish values.
Yeah, he doesn't address morals in here. That's in a separate document. on
But how
morals.
The
can he address,
metaphysical is out.
how can he
No,
address
it's-
morals if you're not the same person from one day to the
Yeah.
next that did something?
Well, you have to read his treatise on human understanding, and that'll tell you what the answer is.
Okay, but what are the arguments against Hume's idea of identity is then how do you hold someone responsible for what he was?
That's a
That he
great
no
question.
longer is.
That's a great question.
What? I think it's a lot of philosophies you can ask that question of. Is there free will and all that sort of stuff? And I think the answer is the people that hold them responsible are basing it on, their conditioning and conditions, etc. So there's no objective standard of morality or
Yeah, but if responsibility is personal responsibility,
yeah.
and if there's no self and there's no identity, then what
Right.
is that person that's responsible?
Well, that's why we
I think
have
it's an
laws.
excellent question.
Yeah, that's
Laws
No,
are,
but Hume is claiming that
No person, no
you're just
responsibility.
imagining that you have an identity and a self.
No, it's you
He
can
says
have
you
can
discover
have
it through memory,
in conditioning, I'd say.
but it
We
just
all have
arises
an
out of your
intuition.
imagination.
Yeah, but it's still there.
the concept of law is a result of human understanding. I mean, that's why we have laws in place. It's so that we have a commonality under a set of circumstances.
Yes, I agree.
Right.
I
So
understand
it's
that.
morality comes from that as well. So that changes in societies. In different societies, certain things are acceptable that are not acceptable in other societies.
What's that? What's the point you're making? What you
Well, the
said
point is
true.
that the identity, the production of laws is a product of the identity within the culture in which it's evolved.
So
So it
they
has an
assume you
identity.
have an identity even though Hume says you don't have a personal identity.
Well, you have an
No.
identity as viewed through perceptions.
I'm just a mess of perceptions.
Yes, that's what he's saying.
It's a bundled, his bundled
And I
theory
have
is what it's called.
if I'm a mess of perceptions, I have no influence on those perceptions because perceptions are just something that come from the outside.
No, you have free will to respond to those perceptions.
And that
Where?
that free
Where
will
does
is
the free will come from?
perceptions.
Perceptions.
Doesn't it?
It's a circular argument.
But I would say it comes from that personal identity. It comes from myself,
Self.
right? And Hume is saying you don't have a self.
Right.
No self, or how can you have free will?
That's free will is formed from your perceptions. It's just added on.
Your perception of yourself, or what? Does
Okay.
perception stand by
I
itself?
don't think people operate with an understand. They don't say I should do this or shouldn't do this.
Yes,
And
I
then-
do.
Oh, yes, they
Yes,
do.
I do.
Let me complete what I said, and then go back and pull up some doctrine that they've read and decide.
Yes, I
think-
do.
Well, okay.
That's what they call values.
But, no, there's
And then you agonize over what to do. You
People
think of
ha-
all the reasons you should do this or
people have
should do that.
values, but I'm saying what's behind. How do they form values?
Based on their culture,
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Perception of the culture,
right?
perception of a book, such as a Bible or whatever. Perception that the church told them. Perceptions.
Well, you
that-
keep on using perception.
Yeah.
How about just culture? How about just church? Why perception?
Well, somehow a church is just a church unless you perceive it in a certain way. So it has to internalize anything. You have to have.
Well, we go
perception
back
of it.
to essences again, right?
No.
Well,
Why?
sure. Well, because there are certain elements that make a church. And if you find those elements in location A, and they're also in location B, it's a church.
Yeah.
That's what essence is all about.
No.
Some of it's in definition.
What do you mean, no?
What you define things
What's
as.
missing?
Yeah, he's saying, for instance, he's using, I'm just repeating myself, that an example of a church that that's destroyed and the new one comes up and it's different materials and all that. The function of it doesn't change. And it's our idea, our perception of the function that this church does this.
But he's talking about the building. He's not talking about the community.
Yeah.
And I think you're talking about the community.
I'm
not
talking about
building.
the community.
The
too.
community,
But
you can go
the
to a church and
burnt
there's not
down,
people
the
there from 100
building
years
burned
ago.
down.
Yeah.
It's still the
But
church, it's
that's
still a
what Hume was
community, but
talking about.
it's a new community.
And through years, the
Well, that's a
congregation
different
changes.
story. When the community changes, that's more like the river changing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So to address what we just said, all the disputes concerning the identity of connected objects are merely verbal, except as far as the relation of parts give rise to some fiction or imaginary principle of union, as we have already observed.
Well, he's the one that calls it a fiction.
No.
Again, the problem with philosophy is language.
Well, that's actually how philosophy has changed.
Right.
Wittgenstein has said all philosophies, all our problems are just language caused.
But he said the identity which we ascribe to the mind of man is only a fictitious one.
Yes.
I think he was ahead of his time doing this.
Everything here is also mirrored in Buddhist thought. So
He also says,
Right, wrong.
as memory alone acquaints us with the continuance and extent of this succession of perceptions, it is to be considered upon that account chiefly as a source of personal identity. So your perceptions create your identity, not the other way around.
right. And perceptions, what I'm saying is, I don't hear him say it directly, is perceptions create our morals. It creates, over a period of time, it creates the way we react to things. You can argue either way in that, but
Well,
it's something that I think.
All
He
right.
doesn't get into morality here. He just
Right.
gets into whether we have an identity or not. And,
Right.
and it's a very anti-Christian view because he says there's no core of you that's
Right.
you.
Yeah,
The one thing I wish he'd addressed a little bit here, which wasn't an issue back then, is narcissism. Because if you're so focused on the idea of the self and the identity, where does a narcissist fit into this?
Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. Join us next time as we discuss another great selection. As Aristotle said, the best way to learn is to get together in small groups and discuss great ideas.